people might well have heard about her with relation to Jung and Freud in the past, but a lot of the information that's out there at the moment focuses on her personal relationship with Jung. How is Sex versus Survival a different account of events? Is it aimed at a different audience? Does it explore different aspects of her past?
I think it's aimed at a very wide audience. It's aimed at people who are interested in the history of psychology and psychoanalysis. It's aimed at feminists. It's aimed at people who are interested in Jewish history. But I think there's a number of significant differences. One is that I reassess her relationship with both Jung and with Freud and the effect on the relationship between those two men. But for me, the most significant aspect of writing the book is reassessing her as a major figure in the intellectual history of the 20th century, and in particular as somebody who tried to create bridges throughout her career between psychology and psychoanalysis, child psychology and psychotherapy, psychiatry and psychoanalysis, biology and psychiatry. I mean, she was a major bridge builder in terms of her intellectual interests and writing.
Given that you were struck by her writing, why do you think it is that her work has been underappreciated?
People who have looked at her have tended to look just at a little selected part of her work, a few letters or one or two papers, and looked at them entirely through the lens of what she might or might not have contributed to Jung's thinking or Freud's thinking, how they affected her, how the relationships were woven into all of this. Nobody has actually written an intellectual history of who she was as an individual. Nobody has actually written something which was focused on her as the centre of the story.
Okay, so she's seen as more an influence on two great minds rather than a potentially great mind herself.
Indeed, and ironically, the two ideas that she is most famous for, which is Freud's death instinct and Jung's anima, I argue in my book that firstly her conception of the death instinct was entirely different from what Freud eventually created, and that the idea that she was the origin of Jung's anima it's the evidence for it is quite circumstantial and I think quite tenuous, but although I do think she gave Jung other ideas which she's not generally credited with. I think you have to look very closely at what she wrote and at what Freud and Jung wrote to understand that the influences were in some ways less, in some ways greater than what is often attributed with.
Can you give us a brief overview of what her main work was about? Her seminal title was Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being, and your book is titled Sex versus Survival. These are very powerful titles. What exactly was it that she was writing about?
Yes. There's a central idea in her main paper, and it's an idea that recurs again and again in her writings, and she wrote not just about psychoanalysis but about child development and many other fields, but the recurring theme is that as human beings we're torn between the drive to reproduce, I mean the compulsion to create the next generation, and the need or desire to look after ourselves as individuals. And she actually saw the drive to reproduce as something that contained its own self-destructive instinct as well, that in order to create the next generation we need to lose, we need to sacrifice a great deal of our own identity. So she saw this tension between the continuity, the preservation of the species was what she called it, using a phrase from Darwin, versus the survival of the individual. And this is a theme that goes throughout her writing.